It goes on Matthew 19, verses 1 to 9. We're looking at marriage and divorce. And scriptures are also found in Luke and Mark, Luke 16, Mark 10, and are even maybe a bit clearer on those two. So it's important to, when you're reading the Gospels, look at all the accounts to try and get an understanding of when you are divorced. There's just the one or two criteria. One is if your spouse dies, then you're released from that marriage because it's a covenant between God, and you become one flesh, and then one person dies, you're released. But also, as we see in this verse, if there's sexual immorality or adultery. Verse 1, now when Jesus had finished these sayings, he went away from Galilee and entered the region of Judea beyond the Jordan. And large crowds followed him, and he healed them there. And the Pharisees came to him and tested him by asking, is it lawful to divorce one's wife for any cause? And they are referring to Deuteronomy, where in 24 verse 1 to 4, where it talks about Moses issuing a certificate of divorce. But when we look at the context of Deuteronomy 24, we see that Moses was actually talking about remarriage and the limitations on remarrying, and if there's a wrongful divorce, then you can't remarry in those situations. He's not actually saying divorce is fine. So they misunderstood that scripture. But Jesus answered, he said in verse 4 of Matthew 19, have you not read that he who has created them from the beginning made them male and female? And so Jesus takes them back to Genesis, the garden, how God made male and female, very important, specifies the genders. There's only two genders. He made them perfectly matched for each other, to procreate, to become one flesh together. There's the principle of leaving the home and cleaving to the wife, and that's all found in Genesis. And then he goes on to say, verse 5, and he said, therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife. That knowing, that cleaving, that becoming one flesh to his wife, and the two will become one flesh, and there's that bondage that no one should separate. And if you tear that bond away, there's a lot of ripping and destruction that happens. God's designed one man for one woman for life, and that's his intention. And there's a wonderful blessing that comes from that, not only a physical blessing, but there's also the spiritual blessing. In 1 Corinthians 7:14 it says, for the unbelieving husband is made holy because of his wife, and the unbelieving wife is made holy because of her husband. Otherwise your children would be unclean, as it is they are holy. And so there's a blessing that even overflows between unbelievers. So the criteria when you get married is always you must marry a believer. But even that union is so strong that there can be a blessing that overflows to the other. In Romans 7 verse 2 to 3 it talks about that it's only through death as that covenants come to an end, and so we've got to take it very seriously. So verse 6 of Matthew 19, so they are no longer one but two, therefore whatever God has joined, let no man separate. And that's why it's so important that God's very against sexual immorality, adultery, those kind of sins. Not only do you sin against the body, and that's why there's actually a physical element to it where people get sick from committing adultery, because of that seriousness of that sin and that union and that covenant that is made between a man and a woman. Verse 7, they said to him, why did Moses command one to give a certificate of divorce and send her away? Again referring to Deuteronomy 24. And he said to them, because of your hardness of heart Moses allowed you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning it was not so. It was never God's intention. Divorce happens. God hates divorce. Malachi talks about that. And so we mustn't, but unfortunately because of the sinfulness of man, these things do happen. Verse 9, and I say to you, whoever divorces wife except for sexual immorality, and marries another woman, commits adultery. And so it's quite, well, this specific one in verse 9 is quite clear in Luke. It's in Luke 16 verse 18 and Mark 10, 11 and 12. And that other than death, the only other reason for divorce would be sexual immorality, because that person has now united themselves with that other. They've broken that covenant in their marriage, and it's a serious thing. Because that's so serious, in that case God would allow a divorce. So if there was adultery that has happened, but he's not saying you have to get divorced, but he would allow a divorce, and only in that circumstance is that allowed.
Okay, if